two regions. SBDC never apologized. That's it. So we start 18 of September 2007. We are in a residing Paikor ladder or Buddha teaching.
Because I want to my country be democracy country. I wanted it. I want my country to be a democracy country. I want my country to be freedom, fair, equality country, peaceful country. So I decided to do that. I already know that I might die, in the prison. If I'm arrested, they might kill me. I already know that, but I don't care. I must do for the truth. I must do for the people.
Many longtime listeners know that our podcast platform was initially focused on interviews about the many spiritual paths that Myanmar offers meditators and monastics. But when the coup hit, we couldn't in good conscience continue to tell those stories with many monastic sites on fire or occupied by soldiers, and the Burmese people living under the military's ongoing reign of terror. So we expanded our mission to cover a wider range of post-coup Myanmar stories. Still, some guests have a unique insight into the intersection of the spiritual with the worldly, allowing a deeper understanding of both planes. Today's guest squarely fits in that category, as you'll soon hear.
Okay, my name is Iselin Frydenlund. I am a professor of the study of religion in Norway. I have been working on Buddhism and politics for quite some time, starting off in Sri Lanka and later working on Myanmar. And over the last years, I have been working together with my colleague Pyo on trying to understand the various Buddhist responses to the military coup in Myanmar in 21.
I welcome you, and I thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Insight Myanmar Podcast. We're speaking in your office at the university in Oslo, having this conversation. From the very start, after 2021, and in what followed, there has been a big question as to what are the monks doing, and then are the monks doing anything? That kind of question. And so getting this deeper analysis of looking at what the Buddhist response and the monastic response has been, I think is a very fascinating, important topic.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's really a great pleasure, and it's a wonderful podcast that you're running. I think, as is well known, there has been a massive lay critique of leading Buddhist monks that have been seen as pro-military. There has been a lot of ridicule of leading monks, a lot of mocking, and this kind of very unusual kind of lack of respect and critique, which is highly unusual in the deeply Buddhist Myanmar. And I think in a way, I mean, that is true. And there are huge differences between the uprisings in 2007, so-called saffron revolution. I'm not sure really how saffron that really was. That's a big question. One, how suffering was it, and how revolutionary was it really? But there's a huge difference between how the 2007 demonstrations appeared in public space compared to what we saw after the February 1st, 21 coup. And I think that because it looks so different, because the lay critique of the Saṅgha has been so vocal, that has led to kind of a conclusion that the monks are either silent or they are pro-military. And I think that is kind of too hasty a conclusion. And my colleague and I, Pjove, we wanted to dig a bit deeper. So what is actually going on the ground? So what we have seen is actually two important things. One is kind of shift over time. And two, there is a polarization and division within the Saṅgha, which is often ignored if you kind of accept that meta-narrative that the Saṅgha is either silent or pro-military. So if we look at the point about change, what is often not known or ignored is the fact that leading Buddhist monks the first 2 weeks after the coup published public statements where they say that they were against the coup. And even the leader of the Mahana, sort of the state Saṅgha committee overseeing the Saṅgha on behalf of the state, even the leader of that organization, in his gentle and mild way, said that this coup is against the will of the people. That meant that he got into house arrest. And that initial kind of hesitation and kind of gentle critique of the coup is now forgotten. And now it's kind of a story that they all supported the military. It's not really true, or it's not really accurate, at least. And then how are we to explain that change? I think we have to look for conflict dynamics beginning in March, April 21. And when this turned into kind of a militant resistance and a full kind of armed revolution in a way. That meant that the more conservative monks and those linked to the military structures of the state would definitely sort of step back and then take on this either pro-military or this very kind of obedient or silent position. The other point that we want to make kind of loud and clear is that this narrative of the unity of the Saṅgha, that is deeply problematic. And monks and nuns or lay people will often give you that narrative, and it's kind of a doctrinal position of the unity of the Saṅgha, and it's deeply Buddhist position. And it's one of the major rules also within the Vinaya, the monastic code, that you should not cause schism.
Yes.
Right? Is one of the parajika rules that you can actually be expelled from the order if someone claims that you are causing a division. So this idea of unity is very, very strong. But it kind of glosses over the fact that Saṅghas to all times and in all places have been not so unified. They have been organized differently in different localities. They have, in Sri Lanka, they're actually organized by caste, or you have different gains. In the Myanmar case, you have different orders. So that notion of unity is kind of more a discourse rather than an empirical reality. And then part of the sort of the lay critique of monks who are pro-military after the coup, there is this notion that, the Saṅgha has just been captured by the military state. And we see that reflected also in academic literature on the Saṅgha, where they said, the Saṅgha has been captured by all this military state across Southeast Asia. You see it in Sri Lanka, you see it in Thailand, you see it in Cambodia, Laos, and now in Myanmar. But that argument only holds true if the state holds full territorial control. And in Myanmar, they don't. Right? And that means that monks or nuns or lay people who do not accept the military state as it operates, they can flee into so-called liberated areas and work and be monks and nuns in a different way. And it's not very easy for the Mahana and others to control monks and nuns in territories held by non-state actors. So this is why we kind of conclude in our work that what we see is polarization and division. So that this kind of discourse of unity is really either propaganda or kind of deeply this kind of doctrinal position and a wish for unity rather than empirical fact on the ground.
That is so fascinating. That is so interesting to get this deep dive into underground, or perhaps not underground, but just away from the usual public discourse that we hear of what monks and nuns are thinking and doing. And I think that this projection of unity, I think it does come very much from this absolute fear of a schism that, I've been in certain contexts, even lay meditation communities where a difference of opinion starts to gather more critical steam and suddenly it's shut down because someone says, oh my God, this is leading to a schism. We can't talk about this anymore because there's such a fear of the parajika and how and what a violation this could be. And that does really stifle, the ability to navigate certain critical conversations. But the other part, and this is a joke I often make, is that especially for outsiders, for foreigners that are not quite understanding, that are seeing, these Buddhist monks and nuns, and the joke I make is that just because they all have the same fashion sense and they all have the same hairstyle does not mean that they all look the same. The most senior monk, Siddhagu Sayadaw, or some meditation master, whoever it is, to the outside appearance, they look exactly like a 20-year-old freshly ordained bhikkhu, because there's no special marks or patterns or something to signify like an elevated level. So this, and they're following the same Buddhist rituals and the same code of, well, maybe not, maybe some follow the code of discipline a little bit more strictly, but for the most part, they're going on alms rounds and eating before 12 o'clock noon and taking part in certain Buddhist rituals. So there is this sense from outsiders and foreigners of this religious order that is happening. And I think that's also why there has been such a lack of nuance that I've seen in how they've been characterized, that, before the 2010s, the monkhood was seemed universally seen outside of Burma as this clergy of peace and wisdom and goodwill and metta and insight and all these things. And then after the 2010s, suddenly they were universally seen as some hateful, patriarchal, anti-Islam, nationalist order. And in both cases, the nuance there was really missing. And so what I'm trying to do is set up this outside perspective that we need to break down. And so if these things are not apparent, if they're not readily accessible or available, but there are these differences of opinion and distinct groups and perspectives, if we can't discern them the way that we might in other discourses or communities, what is the method then for finding out these different opinions and perspectives that take shape, and then how are they being expressed in a different manner to navigate these religious duties and this fear of schism?
No, that's a great reflection, and I think that there are many things to say about what you say now. For one, is this kind of Western Orientalist construction of what Buddhism is. And that is, there are many different sources to why we have come to have this specific image of a Buddhism as apolitical and non-violent. I often blame Max Weber, the German sociologist, because he had such a great influence on Western sociology in general. So that when he said that Buddhism was apolitical, that idea was picked up in large part of the social sciences in the Western academy. But you will find it in popular culture, you will find it in its kind of connection between Buddhism and aesthetics, the commodification of Buddhism into something, kind of a spa product. You know, all these kinds of commercialized, commodified things that we see in relation to Buddhism kind of reinforces the long history of Orientalist construction of Buddhism as pacifism and as something good. But it's a bit strange also I've been working in this field since the late 1990s. People started writing on Buddhism and violence in the early 19th century, actually. Then later again in the 20th century, there was a huge bulk of work done in the 60s and the 70s that look into Buddhism and politics. So it's there, you see. It's nothing new that scholars look into this. But it is as if that kind of knowledge, it's not acknowledged in other disciplines or in broader discourses about religion and politics. So some of us feel that we have to say this again and again and again and again. But in itself, the topic is not really new. But it's carried out in you have different conversations in different academic disciplines. But the study of state and power really started to flourish with the post-colonial state and decolonization processes in Asia. When these post-colonial states, for example in Burma and Sri Lanka, tried to reinstall Buddhism as state ideology. So I think that this very romantic view of Buddhism that has fit a certain Western agenda for various purposes. We need something to adore, maybe something to romanticize, something to hold up. There can be a religion that is, a philosophy. There's something aesthetic. It's good, But that said, that kind of Orientalist construction of Buddhism has also served modernist Buddhist projects in Asia itself. So the same kind of romantic construction of Buddhism as pacifism you can also find among Buddhist actors, who has been very vocal in saying that, well, Islam is the violent religion, but our religion, if we can say it's a religion, perhaps it's not even a religion, it's a philosophy that goes beyond. That is kind of a modernist Buddhist discourse that portrays Buddhism as a pacifist philosophy.
That's very interesting, and it's the picking up on the Orientalist theme. And this is going a bit on a tangent, and I'm not sure how much you've looked into this, so you can let me know. But I've been outside of the way Buddhism itself is portrayed in the West. I have been very interested because this is what some decades ago brought me to Myanmar in the first place, is how specific, particular meditation traditions and teachers also portray the role of Burma and Burmese Buddhism in the West. And I think these can be separated into two broad categories. One is the Goenka tradition, which is quite insular and has quite a messaging that is promoted through there. And the other is just the wider, typically it's called the insight community, which isn't a particular tradition or teacher, but, you could certainly go back to like Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Susan Salzberg and some of their influences, and then people who followed after them. And as diverse and distinct as the Goenka movement and the wider insight movement, which itself is distinct, as different as these are, I have found, not looking at it from an academic point of view, but as a practitioner and as someone who lived in Burma for a while, I have found kind of striking similarities in kind of the well they're drawing from to paint the Buddhist mythology, or in Goenka's case, you can't even use the word Buddhist. So the meditator mythology of the Buddhist teachings as it comes from Myanmar, you have to use a mouthful to avoid that so-called sectarian word. To what degree both of them have kind of drawn from the same well in painting meditative practice as coming from Burma in that same kind of Orientalist way.
But I think that, there is no reason to believe that meditation movements in Myanmar are not in their full right to claim that these are kind of non-violent pacifist practices. My point is that to reduce the whole world of Buddhism to that kind of meditation practices, that is kind of a category mistake. So my point is to open up how we interpret and understand the whole social field of Buddhism, where the liberation project linked to meditation movements is one strand. But then, of course, Buddhism is as complex as any other huge religious system, which means that it contains so many other different projects and aspects and societal fields. They don't have to be kind of conceptually separate. They're all kind of part of a bigger Sāsana, field. But they are nonetheless different in the levels they operate. And this idea that we need to protect the Sāsana, that is as old as, Buddhism itself, And that has, been used to justify all sorts of political projects.
Yeah.
And all these political projects through times have relied on military force. Right, so this is nothing new, in a way. But if you think of Buddhism as something that, this kind of essentialist project of finding pure, essential, authentic Buddhism, that in itself is a very Orientalist project, right? So the project for me and other scholars in this field would be to open this up and see it as a religious system, with all its contradictions inside. So you can do Vipassana meditation, be, fully read in your Abhidhamma literature, and still think that the state is in its full right to use military means in a given situation. I don't think from an emic point of view that is seen as a contradiction. And I think the point here is that quite often people mix up the idea of ahimsa, no harm, with the idea of political pacifism. That are two very, very different things. So when people say, but Buddhism is non-violent, of course, ahimsa is very important in all kinds of Buddhist liberation project, right? But pacifism in the political sense, it's a very, very different field. And if you look at the canonical sources as well, tell me one place in the Pali Canon where the Buddha speaks direct political pacifism to a king. It's not there.
Yeah.
So the Buddha would leave that to the kings. His project was another one. It was a salvific project about individual liberation. He did not preach a new societal and political order.
Right.
It was implicitly accepted. There are many sayings that kings should be good and just and all that, but what that actually means is not very clear. And the Buddha did not really challenge political order as such, right? And then if we open up and say that, Buddhism is not only what's in the Pali Canon, and then you have all this paracanonical and extra-canonical texts, you will find so many different stories of how violence is justified in case of threat to the Sāsana. And the Mahavamsa is, of course, the most famous or infamous one, which is a Sri Lankan 5th century chronicle about kings in Sri Lanka. But it also relates kind of the early Buddhist historiography, and it has been, as is well known in Myanmar, of course, as a kind of a history book for early Buddhism, also in other countries outside of Sri Lanka. So it's also read by Burmese monks. So in that sense, I guess one shouldn't be so surprised when Sita Sayadaw make that very now controversial sermon for Burmese soldiers in the fall of 2017. He makes a very explicit reference to the Mahavamsa, saying that it's not kind of a sin to kill people who are not Buddhists if it's done with the intent of saving Buddhism. That's the reference he's making. But as for me, someone who has been working with the Mahavamsa and Sri Lankan monastic politics for a long time, the way that Sita Sayadaw phrased it in the sermon came as a shock, because even in Sri Lanka, the most militant monks would be much more careful in the way that they speak about it, because they know how controversial that passage is. But when you listen to Sita Sayadaw's sermons in the fall of 2017 to these Burmese soldiers, that only a couple of days after that sermon they were sent to the killing fields in Rakhine. You know, he speaks as if he's not aware of how problematic that textual reference to the Mahavamsa actually is. And that surprised me, to be very, very honest.
That's a really shocking thing. You just said at the end that he speaks as if he's not aware. Mm-hmm. So you're suggesting that there's an interpretation where he is somewhat naive in saying this and not realizing the full impact of the words as they're coming out. Is that what you meant?
I would not say that he is naive, far from it, but I would say that monks in Sri Lanka would never have made a speech like that or a sermon like that, because they know very well how controversial such passages are. They would be far more subtle in their references, because it's a very, very blunt call for killing non-Buddhists. They know, after 3 decades of being in a civil war, how careful they have to be when they make these calls for violence. Mm-hmm. They will allude to it, right? And if they make explicit references to the Mahavamsa, they will make qualifying statements, or they would say that we need to protect our state, we need to protect the country, we need to protect the Sāsana. But this kind of direct reference to that passage, very few people in Sri Lanka would do it, simply because it is so controversial. So I can't speculate in the reasons why. But as the sermon stands, I was very surprised about the way that he did his exegesis. Let's put it that way.
That's very interesting. And I just want to provide some background for listeners that might want to go deeper into this topic. We did have an interview with Sita Sayadaw's attempted biographer, we can say. He was right. He spent many years writing a biography of him that wasn't published, but accumulated all the background information. He's an American monk, Bhikkhu Chintita, I think his name was, and he spoke at length analyzing Sitagu's behavior, which he was not defending and was disappointed by, but he does offer an interpretation that he does feel that Sitagu, some of the things that he did were gravely misinformed and not understanding the impact of what making certain bad choices and not kind of reading the room and then having a certain kind of very negative implications based on what he did, which he did not intend. I'm not supplying, to be clear, I'm not endorsing this interpretation, and I think I'm putting it out there as one informed, controversial view for those listeners to follow up on and take a look at that episode. But that is that is one strand of I would say quite unpopular from both sides and controversial interpretation that basically he was engaging in this context, in this speech, and others as being horribly misinformed and not then understanding the implications of what it is he did.
That might well be, I can't really say to what extent he was misinformed and by whom. I am just saying that this way of making reference to the Mahavamsa would not really be comme il faut in the Sri Lankan context. And after all, they have a couple of centuries in making reference to the text. But perhaps, in Sri Lanka also that there is a huge subtext into it, so that the nationalist militant monks in Sri Lanka can only allude to it and people will understand what they're saying. In the Burmese case, perhaps people are not so familiar with the Mahavamsa, so that the Sitagu Sayadaw felt that he had to explain it in a way, and then it turns out to be rather blunt or harsh or clearly dehumanizing the non-Buddhist other.
Yeah.
Which is sort of, the Mahavamsa is a very complex text and is covering centuries of monastic rule in Sri Lanka. It covers the reign of Ashoka, and it has a million things. But that particular passage of the King Duttugame, who is, after all, the big hero of the text, the king is feeling remorse for having killed so many people on the battleground. And then these arhats, these enlightened beings, come and they comfort him and they say that, well, you haven't really killed anyone, because they weren't Buddhists. And that is a sort of the most classic Buddhist justification of violence that we can find in the Theravada Pali textual universe, in a way. Mm-hmm. What is interesting is that, I was in Myanmar that fall, and I remember people being in shock that he had given that speech, and they feel anger and despair and frustration. How could he possibly say a thing like that? And that was a huge controversy and people criticizing him. And then the coup took place, and then Sitagu Sayadaw very clearly sided with the military. There can't be any discussion about that. All his trips to Moscow and the way he kind of engaged in ritual activities with the generals. But what we see in our work is that in military media outlets, at press conferences, reference are actually made to Sitagu's reference to the Mahavamsa. So this lives on. His 2017 sermon kind of now lives his own post-coup life. But with this kind of changing target, because the target is not now the sort of non-Buddhist, other, right? Mm-hmm. So who is the other now? Mm-hmm. It's the fellow Bamar Buddhist community.
Oh my gosh.
So there is a change in the way that the Mahavamsa reference is used to justify violence. It's now used to justify violence against members of the in-group. And in order for making that logic to work, you would have to say that your opponent is not Buddhist anymore. It's a non-Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what the most sort of clearly defined military and militant monks are doing. They are creating a narrative in which their opponents are non-Buddhists. They are secularist or hidden Muslims or enemies of Buddhism. That's why it's legitimate to kill them. So there is this kind of discursive shift now, as this is sort of not defined external enemies to the Sāsana, but actually among the same group of people, right? So again, you will see this kind of divisions and polarization of different interpretations of what is authentic or true Buddhism. So the militant monks like Uwadawa or some of these very radical monks who train militia groups and all this, they would use that kind of language, that they are protecting Buddhism against the PDFs who are then claimed to be a threat to the Sāsana and therefore legitimate targets. And in all that kind of discursive redirections, we see that the Mahavamsa reference comes up.
That is so incredible. My mind is spinning hearing that, and that what it makes me think of first and foremost is you're painting a picture where the kind of philosophical or religious battle for claiming or reclaiming or owning Buddhism, defining and then owning your definition of Buddhism, which then allows you to unilaterally claim who is Buddhist and who is not according to whatever designs you happen to paint, no matter how accurate they actually are to the Pali Canon. But it's this kind of public space war over defining those boundaries. But what it makes me think of first and foremost is it feels to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, that it's kind of a one-sided battle, because I don't hear so much the other side trying to equally claim, no, we are this thing that you're claiming as Buddhism. This is this rotten core of superstition, of materialism, of breaking precepts, of making the country unsafe for many, so you can't even have alms rounds or meditation practice or all these other things that go along with Buddhism. Or I've spoken to many monks that are on the side of, say, sometimes overtly on the side of the revolution, and sometimes supporting democracy, human rights, aligning with those values, sometimes on the ground and engaged in different humanitarian, not taking a philosophical definition, but certainly, walking the walk of what they're doing to support their communities. But the one thing I have not heard so much myself is kind of a engaging in this information war and this public discourse landscape of where, to me, it seems like there are such obvious lines of then countering the same argumentation of saying, no, you're not protecting the real Buddhism. This is the way you're breaking everything about what the doctrine of Buddhism is and what the ethics are. We are the ones who are trying to save Buddhism from you. And I've always been just a bit surprised that line of argumentation. And again, maybe it's happening beyond my awareness and beyond the discourse I see. But from what I've seen and from the conversations that I've engaged in, I haven't seen that counter argument take place with the same force and the same push and momentum that you see on the other side. So then it just seems something that on the military side, they're owning and defining much more.
Well, it's a very good observation. I think on the one hand, it's true that this kind of pro-military discourse is really strong. And I think this can be seen as a result of a long-term project by the military to actually try to capture the Saṅgha. And this is to see, the changes in policy of the military after 88. My colleague Pyo Wei has written a lot about this on what is called the Saya Dakar program, which was a program established by the military to try to repair relations with the Saṅgha after 88. That implied different policies. But the result of all this, the creation of Buddhist universities, the creation of new meditation centers, more funds into temples, all this we call in our article that we've published on this subject, we call it the military-monastic complex. It's a kind of a structure within the Saṅgha, supported by military means and integrated partly with the military state. That is a very resourceful complex, and they have the means, of course, to give their interpretation and vision of how Buddhism is to protect it and what Buddhism is according to their views. That being said, though, is that they haven't fully managed to capture the Saṅgha. So there are still dissenting voices. There are still different, alternatives. And we have the Myanmar Spring Network among the monks. We have various groups that in their different ways in Thailand as well as in Myanmar who actively support a revolution. Yes. And they try to give their vision of the revolution within a Buddhist ideological framework. So they see the coup as Dhamma. They see democracy and human rights as the true Dhamma.
Yes.
It's always been democratic according to this view. Mm-hmm. Buddhism has always been from the very beginning, and they would also refer to the same text as the other side. So the Aganya Sutta of the Pali Canon is often referred to as a source for a democratic thinking, because the text actually begins with a kind of a mystical dim past where the people did not even need a king. That's revolutionary in Buddhist political thought. So they would kind of follow their own political understanding of what Buddhism is and should be, and they see the Spring Revolution as compatible with that. So they would support. But within that support, you will have different kinds of support. So you would have those who are very harshly criticizing Sita Goseyado or are very kind of revolutionary in the language when they criticize institutional Buddhism and the monastic military complex. Other monks will share the anti-military, pro-democratic resistance, but they would be more kind of careful in the ways that they do it. So they would be much more gentle. And the argument there would be to say that, if we kind of destruct everything that has to do with institutional Buddhism and the order of monks and nuns, what will be left then for Buddhism if the revolution succeeds? So we have to work in specific ways to make the revolution succeed, but we have to do it in a way that is within the confines of the monastic code, the Vinaya.
Sure.
We can't break all the rules, because then what is left, really?
Yeah.
So, revolutionary projects in whatever form, shape or stripe will always kind of represent a challenge to institutionalized religion. And so also for the Saṅgha in Myanmar. What will happen, with institutional Buddhism if the revolution succeeds? And I think trying to understand that question can help us perhaps explain and understand a little bit more about the position of those monks who actually are in favor of the military. monks who are in favor of the military are not only kind of greedy or evil, as the revolutionary forces will tell you, right? Another way we suggest in our work is to rather try to understand why then do these people actually support the military? What is it? And I think that one important thing to consider is this very, very deep-seated fear in Buddhism of anarchy. Mm-hmm. That's a trope that goes through all texts. What happens in society if there's anarchy? We will all lose, and Buddhism will lose. We need order, we need discipline. And of course, that kind of thinking is perhaps easy to combine at some ideological level with this kind of law and order policy of the military state. There are these kind of compatibilities. And I think that this, what we call the Buddhist ideology of order, is important to understand that in a situation where the country has, 600 or so different militant groups and a total chaos, the state has lost more than 50% of its territory. That, some more kind of conservative leading monks and nuns will ask, okay, so in this chaos, what will actually happen to Buddhism? That is kind of a legitimate question to ask. And for some of them, they have kind of landed that, okay, we think that this kind of order, we don't like the military necessarily, but at least they will provide some kind of order. That is better than this kind of complete chaos and anarchy. So I hope the audience and everyone will understand that this is not necessarily my point of view.
Yeah.
It's just to say that if we are to try to understand why people choose different political and ideological paths, we have to be open. What could they possibly mean? And I think that, from the revolutionary resistance, there's a lot of emphasis on, the disappointment they have in Buddhist monks, the claims of nepotism, corruption, the economic exploitation of the poor. These are themes that was very, very salient in our interviews with Buddhist revolutionary monks and also lay Buddhists, CDMers, and they would be very concerned about that. But no one really seemed to engage in the question other than instrumentalist explanations for why, they are co-opted, they are corrupt, they are morally lazy, but to understand that, but there is something about this long tradition in Buddhism of thinking about order and discipline.
Sure.
That kind of gives some kind of ideological background for why people would be opting for what they see as the more secure path for securing Buddhism. Because after all, what will happen after the revolution with Buddhism? What sits at stake is a secular state. That's not acceptable for many of the more conservative leading monks. They would like to have a Buddhist state. And I think that the 2008 constitution de facto means that it is a Buddhist state. So if the NUG in its, negotiations with other actors here, if they are thinking of a secular state, that question will come up. And it's very easy to rally, among the more conservative parts of the population that at least we will protect Buddhism, and it's a state responsibility to protect Buddhism. This is as old as Buddhism itself, right? So that's a very easy rallying point. So the NUG has to think out a strategy for how to handle that. Otherwise, Buddhist nationalist groups or Buddhist protectionist groups, that I prefer to call them, they will very easily engage in that. When we ask the revolutionary Buddhist monks about how would the state of affairs be if the revolution succeeds, then they will say, well, we will have a Dhamma state. And what does a Dhamma state mean? And they would be very specific, saying, well, a Dhamma state does not mean state protection of Buddhism. A Dhamma state is not about this old, traditional and pre-modern Buddhist language of state protection and finding the righteous Buddhist ruler. It's not about that, they would say. It's about creating a state based on social justice and equality among religions and ethnic groups and minority protection. That is a Dhamma state to them. So I think what you ask for is that those voices should be kind of amplified, I guess, or that they should be more visible on the scene. They are there. But they are a radical minority, I guess. So if we think of the Saṅgha as being divided into three major groups, you have the militant monks, who would be Buddhist protectionists, Buddhist nationalists, pro-military, and many of them militant, but various degrees, right? There is a huge difference between Sita Sayadaw and Ubadawa, right? But they would be on the pro-military side. On the other end of the continuum, we will have the pro-revolutionary monks. Also there with internal variation, how engaged you are, how radical you are, if what's at stake is to creating a completely new form of Buddhism, But there are different positions here. And then in the middle, we will find a big group that is kind of a silent majority, perhaps an obedient majority. And it's kind of difficult to know exactly where, that large group would position themselves. I think that some of them would be what we will call the obedient majority. They just obey because that is what the state is saying. And after all, there's a lot of threats here. It's dangerous for monks to speak out, right? So we can't really know for sure if they are silent because they agree or silent because they are afraid. And we need to acknowledge that. Probably there would be both, right? And I also think that we have to acknowledge that some of the monks and nuns who are silent are not necessarily obedient. And they are also engaged in all sorts of pro-revolutionary humanitarian work, helping revolutionaries with shelter, with food. They distribute food in the temples in new ways. So I think this pro-revolutionary part of this is perhaps less visible now because it's so dangerous, but it's still there and it should be acknowledged. And we should not buy into this kind of, at least as scholars, buy into that kind of lay revolutionary critique of the order and say that, well, they all got it more, they all got it wrong. It's very understandable because it's kind of a deep disappointment and this feeling of betrayal of those who were there to protect them.
And that they've supported for so long.
Yeah,
we've been there for you for so long when we need you most.
Yeah.
There's that feeling there.
And
too.
then you close the temple gates and we are shot in the back when you close the gates. That sense of betrayal, which is extremely, important to understand and to acknowledge. And it's a very real thing. But that acknowledgement should not kind of overshadow the fact that there are other groups who really fight for Buddhism in other ways than the pro-military Buddhist nationalist monks. I think there is something about the coverage here also that we are so kind of fascinating. It's a bit kind of sexy, you know, all these militant monks. Ooh, it's very interesting. Yeah. One, it's not so new. Two, they are also a radical minority. The great majority of these monks would be that kind of silent, obedient, in the middle group.
Well, it's the flip side of this Orientalist vision that we ourselves have set up centuries ago, right? That we set up this image of this peaceful, enlightened brethren, and then what's more exciting and sexy than having them turn violent? So both seem like they're different versions of that same imagination.
Yeah, I think you're right. And monks have at times, when they feel that Buddhism is in peril, have either directly supported violence or they have indirectly supported it through state institutions, for example. But still, you won't find monks fighting in Myanmar. And that's important. There are still kind of doctrinal differences when it comes to the use of violence, so that you will not really find monks on the revolutionary side who fight in robes. They disrobe before they go into the PDFs. Yeah, we have militant monks like Wadawa or other monks who do all kinds of ritual blessings and engage in magical services, the yadaya for the military and all that. But have you seen any of them kind of been part of a fighting group? Very few.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't there videos around the Rohingya crisis of monks literally engaged in hacking Rohingyas and violent acts?
There is one, as far as I know, the one from Meitila in 2013. There is this monk running with a machete trying to hack. Yeah. I think that would be kind of the exception to the rule.
Okay.
You won't find this kind of holy warriors brigades. Yeah. Right? That you would find in Christianity or in certain parts of Islamic world, you know. So still this kind of Vinaya injunctions against performing violent acts while in robes, it's still there.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that these monks can justify in other ways all kinds of violent action.
Actually, it's funny that you say that, because now that I'm thinking about that, I remember that this distinction between indirectly being able to advocate for violence versus actually taking part in some kind of violent act. A little clip I remember that really goes to emphasize this point is there is a clip of Siddhu Sayadaw speaking, and as he's speaking, he slaps a mosquito. And that is considered a violent act. That is considered an adama, not a monastic thing to do, and kind of thereby proof of him not being a good monk.
Yeah, it's a question of the intention behind the violent action, right? Intention is, after all, sort of a crucial thing in Buddhist thought and practice. So if the intention was actually to kill that mosquito, which it probably was when he did as he did, then of course that would be an action that would cause negative effects.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But if I took on my sort of militant Buddhist hat right now, I would say that being a Buddhist soldier on the battlefield, if you kill with a clean heart, with the right intention of protecting Buddhism, it will not cause negative karmic effects. And this is what we know from studies of military preaching in Buddhist contexts, for example, from Sri Lanka, that you had kind of military chaplains serving the army, which is quite common in Buddhist armies, actually. And they will say that if you go out in the battlefield against soldiers from the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers of Tamilam, and if you fight them with a clear heart to protect the state and to protect Buddhism in Sri Lanka, you will not be reborn in hell just because you kill people on the battlefield. And I think you would find similar features in the Thai army, and I think this is what Sita Gosero actually tried to do when he gave that sermon. It was this kind of encouragement, and this kind of, like military chaplains in all armies do, they console soldiers. And they encourage for battle. That was what he was doing. And we shouldn't really be so surprised that Buddhist monks would do that. They have been doing this all the way. And if you look at the Pali Canon again, there is no kind of law or prohibition for monks to engage with the military. They're not allowed to stay beyond 3 nights. That's what it says. And it's not allowed for monks to become soldiers. Right? Then they have to disrobe. But it doesn't say that they can't engage with soldiers. Right? I think this comes to this huge discussion in Buddhist studies on how you view Buddhist ethics. Probably, if you think that Buddhist ethic is kind of universalistic, that there is one guiding principle of the whole thing, and that is ahimsa, then violence is not permissible in any, regard or in any sphere of life.
And then it feels like cognitive dissonance to somehow be able to make that bridge.
Yeah. And if you think that, then how to explain
exactly
Buddhist violence through history, then you have to say that, well, it's a degeneration of the pure teachings. That would be the logical kind of answer to that. Another way would be to say that, well, Buddhist ethics, like most, huge ethical systems, would be particularistic. So you have different positions. You will find different ethical principles in different textual sources. And then you would perhaps conclude by saying that Buddhist ethics is very contextual. It depends who is doing it, in what context, for what purpose, in what state of mind. All kinds of considerations would have to be taken in to make a moral judgment of a particular action, such as killing.
Why this ideological claim that the military is putting out there of the ownership of who's in the Sāsana and who gets to be a Buddhist and who's not, why there isn't a greater ideological argument and war from the other side to reclaim their version of it, what they're doing to support the revolution and do work on the ground, and how they're seeing the military takeover as a Dhamma, and a country of Dhamma being one that welcomes other minorities and finds a place for them, and they live in safety, and they espouse that. The military is saying that they're there to protect Buddhism. They're there to, going back to what you said, to restore law and order, to prevent the chaos, to establish some kind of safety and security. Well, their actions have clearly not done that, and so the counter argument for the military being the agent that is protecting Buddhism, as they say, is to present a picture of the military is the biggest threat and the biggest danger, the biggest risk we have for losing the Sāsana. And, Alicia Turner in her work Saving Buddhism has also illustrated how these existential fears of the Sāsana leaving they're not so much caused by outside triggers, be they colonialism or be they, the perceived rise of Islam or modernity. They are inherent internal mechanisms and cycles for knowing that the Sāsana is impermanent and one day it's going to leave, and let's hope that let's do what we can to save it during our lifetimes. And these outside conditions are just triggers that are coming. Why not use that logic to turn the tables back on them and see
the military as the greatest danger to the Sāsana today. And that, yes, this law and order that we want, this kind of restoration of, our traditional society, this safety that we're trying to establish, and chaos and everything else. Well, the military is the one that is, and then you can just go through the list of, bombing monasteries and killing monks. And how many images have we seen of and Buddha statues riddled with bullets, burned, scorched, in all these different kind of destructions, monasteries destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. It seems right there on the table to be able to point to the military being a destructive force that is putting all of the Sāsana at risk, and that they have to be stopped and their excesses have to be prevented in order to protect Buddhism and protect the Sāsana and establish, to reestablish a sense of order in society, order that they, in their yada and their materialistic endeavors and their destructive force, that they are the ones that are causing this risk of the Sāsana being destroyed or fading or being degraded more than anyone else. And so,
but that argument is there. So that would be exactly the argument of the revolutionary monks, like King Zero. It would exactly be this kind of argument. So the question is it's not, if it's not there, it is obviously there. The question is, why isn't it stronger? Right?
Okay, right.
Yeah. And I guess that perhaps this could be explained by two different factors. The first one would be that Buddhist nationalist organizations have worked their way through the Saṅgha for quite long time now. So they had kind of an ideological strong position in the first place when the coup happened. So that way of thinking about how to protect the Sāsana was in a kind of an aggressive, defensive way, some people will argue. The other thing, the other factor would be the might of the military state. I mean, we seem to kind of forget in this conversation how dangerous Myanmar has become. If you share the views that you explained now, that we want to protect Buddhism in a different way, where can you preach that without some monastic spy reporting? I think we sometimes sitting here safe outside of Myanmar kind of forget how extreme the situation is, how dangerous it is, how careful the networks of resistance have to be, even in Bangkok. I mean, we interviewed Burmese monks in Bangkok. They have to be extremely careful who they talk to, where they meet, what kind of information is shared with whom, and what kind of information, So we just have to bear that in mind. I mean, 3 leading Buddhist monks close to the NLD were jailed on the 1st of February 2021. Why is that? Because the military knew that these monks could produce that kind of alternative Buddhist discourse, right? They had to silence them as quickly as they could, because they knew that there are these pockets of kind of alternative ways of thinking about Buddhism that would go against what the military-monastic complex has produced of Buddhist ideologies of how to protect Buddhism. So it's there. We just have to, I guess that what we can do in the future is to give those voices more space and to facilitate that kind of alternative discourses, because they are there. And if you talk to lay people, we interviewed several lay Buddhists among the CDMers, they still see themselves as Buddhists.
Yeah, sure.
They haven't left, right? But they are so fed up with institutional Buddhism, the Saṅgha as such, because they see it as part of that military-monastic complex. We can't reform it, it's too ingrained, it has to radically change. So one hypothesis that I'm kind of throwing out now is that with time we might perhaps see the coming of new lay reformist Buddhist movements that offer completely different alternatives that do not follow the Saṅgha structure, if that is in the end captured by the military state, that you don't have alternatives, then you can find new lay movements where it is different visions of what it is to protect Buddhism.
Why would it be a new lay movement when you have revolutionary monks and diaspora monks and exile monks who can bring the monastic layers into the revolutionary movement? Why would it be outside of them?
Yeah, so that's a really important question, and I think I don't know the answer to it yet, simply because it depends on how the civil war, how it will, develop over time. Because if you have more territories that are liberated, where these Buddhist monks and nuns can form their alternative Saṅgha structures in that territory, then they can build up something which is more, liberal or democratic or de-linked from military-monastic institutions. That would be the dream and vision of many of the lay revolutionaries as well as the monastic revolutionaries. But as it stands now, they are kind of an in-between situation where they still are kind of, if not directly disciplined, they still have this internal monastic relations inside of the Saṅgha structure. So, as far as I know, no one has come up with the idea to establish a completely independent new Saṅgha, independent of the state. But one can imagine that in the future, though.
Wow! But with the fear of schism, that's.
But if you say that the old structure is immoral, is unjust, it's not truly Buddhist, you could just flip that argument, right, and say that it's not valid. So we will start a new. And
have you heard any rumblings of that? That's incredible.
No, I'm just theorizing or hypothesizing.
I like where you're going, though.
It could happen. The possibility would be there. I mean, and the Saṅgha, despite of all this talk about unity and non-schism, the Saṅgha is splitting all the time. We have new Nikayas. That's the Pali word for that. Sri Lankan history is full of new Nikayas. So, it's possible.
But usually formed on subtle aspects of discipline and monastic code. This would be a major...
it depends on how you theorize that, or the ways in which that you articulate that kind of alternative structure. But I don't know if that work has begun or if people are talking about. I have no indication in my material that people are thinking that. But I would be surprised if they don't. Like, what about the monks in the Rakhine state under AA control? I mean, the state is not present. Shall they obey the orders of the Mahana? Yeah, maybe in some respect, because that would follow the line and it will kind of keep it together. But in other practical matters, perhaps they don't, right? And if monks are accused of not keeping the Vinaya, who are the ones to control that? It would be the local monk in the temple that you are staying at that time, not necessarily the monk of the monastery where you were at before 21. So the point I'm making is that these things are in flux, and let's see how it works out. But when it comes to the point about the lay Buddhist movement, that was really based on interview material, that they were so tired of the corruption and nepotism and the monastic military complex as they saw it, and they would not leave their Buddhist identity or religious understanding, behind. And that's when they start talking about, we have to look for alternatives. Cool. So that is perhaps closer in future than a radical break of the Saṅgha at a formal basis. But this idea of the unity of the Saṅgha, I mean, yeah, as an idea and concept is very old, but in practice is very new. Because if you are to control the Saṅgha, it requires the technologies of a modern state. I mean, in the Burmese case, it was Ne Win in the 80s. Right before that, it was more decentralized. They didn't have the same kind of control. So we have kind of gotten used to the idea that this is a very uniform, singular entity. Like an army, in a way. But historically, it's never been like that.
Right. Yeah.
And so the argument we try to make is that, well, the Saṅgha capture is not total in Myanmar simply because the state does not control the territory 100%. So they have to manage their own affairs to some extent in these liberated areas. And what will happen in the future? Well, we don't know. But it's extremely interesting to even to think of the possibility that they might, if not break away, so at least in practice, kind of run their own business with less state interference, right?
Yeah, that is so interesting. And I want to go back to that lay empowerment and ownership of a new direction of Buddhism and ask some clarifying questions, because there's different ways to look at that. There's a way where they're doing that through more identity and more the superficial aspects of what it means to just be Buddhist in the world. And then there's also a deeper spiritual layer of the meditation practice. And this is where it calls back to me, like the 1950s in Burma, where there was, for the first time, these lay mass meditation movements that were occurring, and meditation practice itself became something of an identity and a practice of the newly independent Burma, and also a new form of being able to access the Buddhist teachings not through the intermediary of a monk, but through direct experience and of someone young and old, female, a householder that's going out into the world, all different kinds of people that are now able to engage directly. And there was this tremendous excitement during those 1950s of being able to go and learn these teachings and see them for yourself for the first time as a layperson, which then, went on to the greater mindfulness movement in the West. But, and so when you talk about kind of a further lay ownership, I can't help but think of the lay empowerment that we saw after World War II, and that Lady Sayadaw, perhaps laid the seeds for in terms of how it took off. But there are a couple different ways to think of that lay empowerment and ownership. And that's where I come back to again, like there could be this direct spiritual practice of attainment that is prioritizing the pathway to liberation that oneself is walking through direct insight experience over the merit being made to becoming a monk or supporting a monk. That's one way of lay empowerment and greater involvement. Another is the more kind of political, social identity markers that perhaps, one could say would be more superficial and just on a societal level. So what, or maybe there's a third option, but what are you seeing and what are you hearing that it could start to tend towards?
That's a great question. I'm not sure, to be honest, but based on the interview material that we have with these lay Buddhist CDMers, I think they would go for a third option, which would be this kind of combination of the connection between the individual empowerment and realization with social activism. I don't think that they could see them as it's not possible for them to disconnect them, I would say. But I think, as far as I can tell from our interview material, it would be that for them to kind of retreat into this kind of defined non-political space of meditation practice would be immoral. And this in their view, this idea of the non-political is not possible in a conflict situation like this. Mm-hmm. So they would go, I think, more in the tradition of socially engaged Buddhism, where you combine the two in a way. But I think the point that they really wanted to share with us was that don't buy into this narrative that we all lose faith in Buddhism now because it's a revolution. Buddhism is still with us as this kind of personal practice, but it's also that kind of realization of what the Dhamma is and the need for social justice that kind of informs this kind of societal engagement. So in their view, it would be the combination that the individual and the societal are so interconnected. And their experiences, with extreme violence that all of them have, I don't think it would be possible for them to kind of retreat in a kind of individualized, privatized space of individual liberation. I can't really see that would be a viable option for them. But I don't know how, in what form they would combine it. I think, but they will definitely avoid this kind of traditional Saṅgha structures. So that, of course, is a big blow for institutional Buddhism in Myanmar. And kind of this argument that, supporting the traditional Saṅgha is to give support to the military. That kind of attitude is very strong among that young generation.
At this, I think I agree with you that the pursuit of an intensive practice as a recluse leading to full liberation at this time in this context is not something I see. But when I do talk to a number of Burmese or Buddhist people that are in the resistance, whether they're exiles or PDF or CDM or whatever it is, when I speak to them and I include the question, is there a spiritual practice you're following as you're doing all of this? What are you encompassing in terms of, mental health or spiritual practice or Buddhism or whatnot? I'm really amazed how few, if any, have ever answered nothing. Face will just light up and they'll say, oh yes, there are these two monks and all of his discourses are on YouTube, and whenever I just want to calm down, I go and listen to them. I just listen to these discourses and they set my mind right. Or I do this meditation practice I learned when I was a kid and it helps me to remember, or I have these books with me and I always go through the books of this particular monk that really speaks to me. That background of kind of mental balance and calm and centering yourself through traditional Buddhist means, I'm really amazed how much this is a through line of almost so many people that I speak to that have a Buddhist background that isn't really coming out front and center in terms of the work they're doing, but it's always there in the background. But what's interesting, and this is more true of the younger generation, is I find that of the older generation, this is often the only thing they go to, and it's more of the traditional Buddhist framework. Of the younger generation, it will be this, which kind of surprises me in and of itself to some extent, because I'll speak to some that are quite on the revolutionary side of things, that are internationally connected, that have had a more sophisticated access to more sophisticated ideas and things, and yet they'll often mention and cite these traditional Buddhist references that daily or at most weekly they're still accessing, but with that are open to Western style of mental health as well, including therapy and good sleep and aromatherapy and and eating well and exercise and sometimes like Eckhart Tolle or, you know, non-Buddhist thinkers that are still kind of welcoming into a spiritual field that they're, and to me, if there's some direction, and who knows now, I mean, these fault lines are still being formed, but if there's something we might glean for a direction it goes, this is what's really interesting to me, are the younger generation, the traditional Buddhist concepts and speakers, you know, being used sometimes through new technology like YouTube, sometimes through Burmese books they have with them. But this kind of combined and intertwined with aromatherapy, with Eckhart Tolle, with traditional forms of therapy. And, you know, and this kind of also just speaks to how incredible I find it, and this is somewhat of a different direction, but still connected to this topic, how aware this resistance movement is to the concept of mental health. I am just so amazed at how attuned to this they are, how careful they are with this, how much they talk about it, how much they think about it. They work on it themselves. They help with their friends and their peers to make sure that they're also, you know, their mental stability is being supported in the ways that it can. And to what degree some of these traditional Buddhist frameworks of sermons and chanting and ethics and meditation, of course, how much these are filling those categories of mental health and balance.
Yeah, no, I think you're proving the point that we are trying to make, actually, in the project, because there has been, from political scientists and commentators, so much emphasis on the critique of the Saṅgha, the critique of the military monks, that the flavor of the revolution is really a secular revolution. It's a sovereignty of the people. It's not the saffron revolution. It's a total shift, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
That is all true, but that does not mean that religion has gone away. How could it possibly go away in one of the most religious countries in the world overnight? Of course it's there. And all that reservoir, cultural and religious reservoir, that can be used as a resource in times of need, and in terms of networks, in terms of ideology, and in terms of mental health practices, as you mentioned now. So I just think it fits very well in, and the need for us to recognize that religion has not gone away simply because it was not kind of a revolution along Saffron Revolution 2007 public image of change, you know. And there are many new things about it in 2021 in terms of thinking anew about ethnic relationships and interreligious, you know, super diversity and all kinds of new things in Myanmar society. But that doesn't take away that people are born and bred in a deeply religious culture. And of course they will resort to meditation when you feel stress or when you have these kind of anxieties. It's a kind of a reservoir that is there. But what is interesting in I find in what you say is that what it sounds to me that you are describing is a more individualized Buddhist practice along Buddhist modernist lines, you know? So it's more kind of delinked from the traditional socio-political structures inside of Myanmar. So that is a new thing, which is very interesting to follow. Will that mean some kind of lay revival, as we discussed previously, or will it eventually mean kind of lower levels in religiosity, however measured and defined? I think that future research have to look into that. We don't know the answer yet, but it's kind of finding new ways of expression. And when these young people kind of combine it, that's very new agey, isn't it? You pick and choose
it's
from a kind
table.
It's a kind of an open religious market. I mean, you just on YouTube you can find all kinds of things that you feel, you know, can work for you. But of course you will have that kind of traditional repertoire with you.
Well, that's what's so interesting. It is the buffet table approach, but what is on every plate when I ask the question is a Buddhist monk. So it's which is what sets it apart from kind of the Western style buffet table appetizer, is that is that they will, in some cases, Eckhart Tolle or aromatherapy or some of these other mental health things, but it's always a handful of Burmese monks, and they are delivering traditional style of discourses or books or meditation practice. And so it's so it is, even as we're looking at the empowerment and the lay agency of being able to not just go to this pagoda or this monastery at this particular time with their whole community, with their whole family, perform these rituals, perform these kind of expectations that go along with all the ceremonies and everything else that goes with it. Maybe it's not quite that, but it's still picking and choosing from that traditional Saṅgha framework that they came from. So there is this interesting hybrid I'm not sure exactly how to think about.
Yeah, it's a kind of a religious change, but religion changes are not necessarily very abrupt. I mean, as you say, the monks are still there. But what would be really interesting to know is which kind of monks do they actually listen to, and how do they evaluate the standing and the position of that monk in this political context. You know, do they listen to the Spring Revolutionary monks when they give Dhamma talks? They will not listen to Sita Gosedo anymore,
No,
for
of course,
sure,
of course not.
right?
Yeah.
And there are many others that they will put aside.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of silent boycott of monks. You just stop going to the temple, you stop giving the donations, you just don't listen to them at YouTube anymore. So it would be very interesting to do a kind of a systematic study of, okay, so which monks do they actually listen to? And on what grounds? Is it because they excel in Abhidhamma, or they excel in practical meditation? What is it that they find sort of just and good then within that structure? That would be super interesting to know. Or if they de-link them from the political terrain. But that is also that would be surprising in a way, given that they see everything as hyper-political.
Well, from the ones I've spoken to, it is a bit of a de-linking with an asterisk, in the sense that when you're trying to find mental balance and peace, you don't necessarily want a revolutionary aligned monk giving you more of the content that you're trying to take a break from. And so it's not to say that they wouldn't listen to revolutionary monks, but as a calming practice, as a kind of centering practice, I don't think that would really do it. I think they're looking for monks that have a certain kind of interpretation or a certain meditation practice or a certain way of talking, which really speaks to them. But, and that's where the asterisks come, they could do all of that, but if they're on the wrong side of history, then they're probably not welcome. So the monks aren't necessarily having the ones I've spoken to, the small sample size, that they're accessing to have a kind of calming and centering practice and study. They're not looking for those political messages at that time, because their whole purpose is to take a break from that. But except in rare cases, which there's one I'll get into in a moment, even if their Buddhist background and knowledge, from a scriptural or meditative standpoint might be solid, if they're aligned with the military or even seeming to be, that's not a direction they would engage in. But I did talk to one person where that was the exception, where he had been a longtime follower of Dhammadutta Sayadaw and knew about the controversy surrounding him, did not necessarily agree with the decisions. And this is also a very kind of independent free thinker, as self-described. So, this is kind of why he was able to navigate this. And we talked about this for some time on the podcast, because I found the way he was engaging was such an outlier that I became very interested in it. And he explained that he was not so satisfied with what Dhammadutta Sayadaw had done politically and socially and some of his actions, and had some kind of nuanced information of the difficulty of the maneuverability of what monks could do, which I kind of challenged and pushed back. But at the end of the day, it did get to a place where he acknowledged that he found his teachings incredibly inspiring, that he grew spiritually and grew as a Buddhist because of them. and was trying to access that thread and that part of Dhammadutta while knowing and somewhat leaving aside, at least temporarily, the other part of it to be able to have that spiritual growth, which I then, as he said that, I then contrasted by talking about another close friend who was also on the podcast some years ago, a Burmese Buddhist who had also greatly revered Dhammadutta Sayadaw and studied under him and been very involved. And when his actions did not accord with the revolution, cut him off entirely. And even acknowledging the growth and the lessons learned from him, felt that there was just no place longer in his life for a monk who was not there for him and for his aspirations and aspirations of the community at the time that he most needed him. And so two very different models of that engagement.
And that last narrative is what really resonates in the material that we have, that people have been so extremely disappointed with monks. They would say, we thought this was a democratic, leaning and liberal monk.
Yes.
He has given me so much.
Right.
And now he's on the wrong side of things.
Yeah.
We just leave him all together.
Yeah.
That's, as far as I know, that's kind of the most common option. But again, I mean, this is a research project, to figure out how people maneuver, shifting positionalities as well. But it's interesting, the point that you make that, that they still will engage with traditional authorities. And maybe you're right that they do. But among the CDMers that we engaged in, they were just so up in arms.
Yeah.
With the disappointment. So that's where this idea of kind of, there must be some lay initiatives here. That kind of talk. But I don't know, the future will tell what will happen. Perhaps this whole coup will in the end lead to a huge blow to Buddhism in Myanmar. Be it institutional or non-institutional. That people over time will find other ways of finding meaning other than Buddhism. I hope not though, but it might.
I want to prompt you on the other side of engagement and Buddhist practice, or Buddhist practice in quotes, because this is certainly circumspect. You referenced it in passing, and I just would like to ask you to unpack it, especially for those listeners that maybe have heard about this in some kind of passing but haven't quite understood the strangeness and the extremely powerful role this is playing, and that's yariya. The how it's come to be a force, what is it, how it's applied, going into some of that detail.
Well, it's a sort of part of a Burmese Buddhist tradition. That kind of magical practices are found all over Buddhist cultures. We see it in Sri Lanka as well, but it has a different name. So in that sense, it's not exclusive to Burmese Buddhism. Buddhism is a kind of syncretic in its own terms, that it's kind of adopted various local practices over time. But these practices are surprisingly similar across different Buddhist cultures, so that you have in Sri Lanka you won't have the nuts, but you call them the deva. Deva means God, and they play the same or similar function in Sri Lanka that they do in Burma, and similar pattern you will see in other Theravada Buddhist countries as well. So these kinds of what shall I say, more practical technologies for getting protection, to achieve something in this world. Meditation is good for the path towards liberation, right? But that doesn't necessarily protect you in this life, right? Which is called the laukika, this worldly affairs, and lokotara, which is sort of the otherworldly, geared towards nirvana, or liberation. So in this world, there are many things that Buddhists can do. They can perform these kind of classic Buddhist rituals that are linked to the production of punya, the good results of your actions, and then wish for rebirth in a better place than you are now. But there are also many other practices that are really apotropic, that they are for the protection of humans. And that is sort of the here and now, in a way. And that follows specific technologies. And monks have engaged in it, lay people have engaged in it, people on the pro-revolutionary side have engaged in the other rituals. But the military has been the most kind of infamous, player in Yadaya rituals, either for protection of their soldiers or the destruction of defined enemies. But if we are to compare the ritual practices of the Burmese army to other Buddhist armies I know of, I would say that they are much more openly engaged in that kind of practices than what I know from Sri Lanka or in Thailand. As far as I know, that kind of magical practices have not been used by generals in Sri Lanka ever. They would engage in protective rituals like imparita chanting, recitations from certain sections from the Pali Canon that will provide protection for those involved in the rituals. And during the civil war in Sri Lanka, Buddhist military chaplains, as it were, monks linked to the military, would recite parita for 7 days, for example, before the soldiers would go into a huge battle in northern parts of Sri Lanka. So that is not Yadaya, but it's about the same thing in a way. It's about securing and giving protection for a specific group of people. But the Yadaya practices in the Burmese army, as far as I can see, are quite extraordinary in the way that is institutionalized, is very open. They have specific monks and ritual masters connected to them, and all kinds of ritual practices seem to be of utmost importance for Minoline and his wife. And how we are to explain why they do that.
That's the question.
That's the question. Well, for one, many armies in Asia do engage in that. And I'm Norwegian, and just say that we have military chaplaincy in the Norwegian armed forces as well. They provide all kinds of ritual, the Christian way, to Christian soldiers. Now we've got an imam and a humanist as well, so they provide their specific rituals. Some of these rituals are kind of magic in a way. Norwegian soldiers, before going into battle, they will say a prayer asking for protection. Bønn på linja, it's called in Norwegian language. It means prayer on the line before you go into battle. So in one aspect, I would like to kind of demystify the Burmese army a little bit in saying that kind of protective practices are very common and has been for all armies in all places through world history. I think we could just establish that. But of course, when we compare to other armies right now, they seem to be more engaged in it. And the question is, why are they? Is it because they are upholders of a more traditionalist systems, which means that these kind of practices can live protected and isolated within a confined state structure? Perhaps that would be kind of a functionalist explanation to it. Another possible explanation would be that the generals don't necessarily believe so much in it themselves, but they assume that there is a huge kind of population that would buy into that kind of symbolic exchange. So it's a way of seeking legitimacy for an army that is hugely unpopular. I think the former has some more is a more valid explanation, simply because people have shown that they don't buy into that, and then the military doesn't have any legitimacy anyway. And the more yada yada used, the less the people seem to believe in them, and they ridicule them. And this buying of white elephants and the amulets and the red rubies and all that, you see people mock them online. So the kind of popular argument would be to say that, well, they are losing, so they are desperate, so that's why they engage in all kinds of yada yada techniques. But I think the first explanation is the one that we should look into. That is kind of a confined cultural, institutional space where these practices are seen to be valid, at least in some circles of the military.
What do we know about some of the yada yada advisors or mystics, or those that are close to the generals, the Rasputin types that are, who knows what they're spouting?
But Wasabek Sayadaw also said this thing about shooting in the head, which is why people mocked him back, and in the streets of Yangon they would put on the longes of women that are then seen as kind of ritually unclean, potentially damaging the soldiers' pon or male honor, and then they will put these printouts of images of Wasabek Sayadaw together with the supposedly ritually impure longes. So that was a way of pushing back in this kind of symbolic, ritualistic warfare against that particular monk. That monk has been close to Minoline for a very long time, and he's a Shan monk. Minoline was stationed in the Shan state. During his time in the Shan state, he became close with Wasabek Sayadaw. So it's a very close personal relationship between him and this monk and Minoline's wife. They go way back, decades, way back. I think Wasabek Sayadaw also at some point made some rather good videos on meditation practice. So that again comes up, that
incredible.
Of course you can be a great meditation master and still a very violent yada pro-military monk. These are not mutually exclusive practices. But we can ask Pyoe about Wasabek Sayadaw, but he was hugely unpopular because of that alleged quote on shoot him in the head. There's so many things that are unclear to me, like future discussions on federal charters and the role of religion in that. I started collecting some of these drafts of these different states, assemblies produce drafts of possible constitutional text. And then it's collected by the NUG and they try to negotiate over that on the role of religion and all this and how they view marriage and stuff like that. I've worked quite a lot on the race and religion laws back in 2015. So that would be another possible rallying point for Buddhist nationalists. The Constitution, Protection of Buddhism, and kind of the race and religion laws from 2015 that easily can be mobilized around. We all know of the Myanmar Spring Network for monks. We all know that there are good forces working for something else. So I think it's kind of this sensationalist plus this kind of methodological question that comes up. Because if you sit in diaspora and just read sort of all the mockings of the monks online, you believe that this is all about a secular revolution.
Mm-hmm. But those Burmese that are mocking those monks online might very well be going home and listening to
So that's
a sermon
why we have to do field work.
Yeah.
That's why interviews, that's why qualitative research is important, because then there is at least one way for us to try to cast the net wider, so that we get a broader of all these contradictions, in what people do and say, which can be quite different from what they write online.
Yeah.
So if you're going to write of the secular revolution of Myanmar, I would say, well, it's secular in the sense that what is framing, because I think if we buy the argument that this is a secular revolution, we have to think through what secular actually means then. It's secular in the sense that it's not framed by Buddhist concerns as such, right? It's about democracy, it's about human rights, it's about interethnic relations, it's about class, it's about hierarchies. All kinds of issues going on, not necessarily anything to do with Buddhism per se. But that doesn't mean that people's actions and the way that they perform this revolution is not, informed by, the sea they swim in. And that would be, from very many people, a Buddhist sea or a Buddhist worldview. So it is there necessarily, so that these people, the revolutionaries, engage in meditation practices, or they see the monk and they are very critical of the Saṅgha when they are online. Of course, they can be all of that at the same time.
Right.
And when you ask them, is this a revolution to fight for Buddhism or save Buddhism, they say, well, no, this is about democracy. We fight for social justice, and Buddhism is on our side. That is what Buddhism is really about, is creating a fair and just state where all can be free.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that there's been so much focus on the more extreme factions of the Saṅgha, rightly so, and deserving that attention and deserving that criticism, and that the kind of destructive role that they've played, and all of that is well justified. But I feel that has drowned out the ability, at least from where I'm sitting, and I don't know how much this is true of academic circles, but in the discussions I've had outside of fellow meditators or other Buddhists, that to call attention outside of those extremist voices and those that are clearly supporting the military or complicit in some ways, the other work of monks who have not been so visible, or have not been visible because of safety or because of language and culture and religiosity. They've been very visible in their own communities, but not being able to bridge with sermons and activisms into other environments and garner attention. But it has felt a bit awkward for me to know how to point to and bring up those involvements without appearing to be an apologist or minimizing the what's happening in the extreme faction. And it's like, here we go again with Myanmar of how is there a way to acknowledge both at the same time? Does acknowledging one mean necessarily that you have to diminish and crush down and stop the other? Is there a way that we can acknowledge both simultaneously, the existence of those extremist monks and the destruction that they're doing and the complicit ways they're behaving, while also acknowledging in the Saṅgha the existence of those other monks who are engaging in very different ways and having very different values and very active in their own ways? And it feels hard for many to be able to hold the discourse of both of those simultaneously, and the discomfort of that.
Yeah, but it's also kind of an empirical question as well, because when you say the word acknowledge, one could take that as to mean that you kind of say that there is some truth to their claims. That is not necessarily what we have in mind, right? But we acknowledge their existence, and that's an empirical fact. We know that there are pro-military monks. We know that there are militant monks who are close to paramilitary groups and train militias. On the other hand, we know for a fact that there are pro-revolutionary monks who support various groups within the revolutionary projects. They will not use violence, but they are very close in supporting all kinds of revolutionary structures. Some of them even serve as kind of military chaplains for the PDFs. We know of monks who they do not take up arms, they do not disrobe, they console PDF soldiers when they come back at night. They conduct the funerals, they contact the families, they do all that kind of hard emotional and ritual work that is needed in times of war. That's a fact, you know. So we know, but this is why we need, you know, empirical research, I would say, and we need qualitative research where we go in as long as possible to do research inside of Myanmar, to talk to people and to see what they do, and we can't kind of, you know, only rely on textual studies or, you know, social media studies, because people can mock the senior monks as much as they like online, but still, as you mentioned, do their meditation practices, or they are engaged in the local temple in all kinds of humanitarian assistance to the pro-revolutionary monks. Of course, it's difficult to do work inside of Myanmar, and Burmese scholars who are inside, they risk their lives at a daily basis to gather information, and we need to protect them and support them in all possible ways, and recognize kind of the heroic work that they are doing. And for those of us who are now on the outside, we need to be a bit modest in the claims that we do. We are not inside. We can't do, most of us, ethnographic work inside of Myanmar at the time. That means that we have only limited access to certain kinds of knowledge of what is going on. So as long as we are aware, all of us, of the limitations in doing research in a revolutionary situation, then we perhaps can also be more open for other possibilities of what is going on, and be able to counter the narrative that, one, this is all kind of a secularist revolution, or two, that the Saṅgha now has all gone extremist kind of argument, which is not really true. And on that label of extremism, I would generally be very cautious in labeling someone an extremist. What do we need? What do we mean by that term, really? It's something that we label someone else that we don't like. It's a highly normative position, and sometimes we can perhaps defend the use, but I try, as someone who is writing about different political positions, try to be a little bit modest again on what kind of label. They will not see themselves as extremists, right? They will see themselves as sort of defending the Sāsana in the proper way that is necessary in this time of anarchy and chaos. And then, of course, some of these monks who train paramilitary groups and militias, it's very tempting to call them extremists, but perhaps, again, we should be a little bit careful with that and choose other more descriptive and less normative wordings. That's a controversial thing perhaps to say, because it could, people can take me as for kind of downplaying the damage that these monks are doing. I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to keep somewhat an analytical distance and not try to jump into all kinds of normative language, although it's very clear who in these camps I personally would support.
Sure, and I think it also comes down to, given that there's not the field access, what kinds of questions are you asking? What kinds of assumptions are you making? Going back to, just because you may be criticizing certain monks online, one can rush to an assumption of what that then means about a less complex, less nuanced image of the way this person might engage or not engage in Buddhist practice. And so that then comes to what are you looking at? What are you not looking at? What are you predisposed to? What assumptions being made? What biases are at play? And again, going back to what questions are being asked and not asked that are uncovering one set of thing and not looking at other sets of data that are right there because you're not predisposed to, to be open to it or to inquire, to ask the kinds of inquiries that would lead to that discovery and then that analysis.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. So with that, I thank you so much for joining us for this in-depth conversation about a subject which I could really go on for hours and hours about, and maybe at some future time we'll be able to pick it up again later. I find this personally just so important, so fascinating, so interesting, covering so many areas inside and outside of Burma, and certainly, part and parcel of the initial factors that brought me into the orbit some time ago, meditation practice.
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me, and thanks for sharing your great insights and knowledge of this field as well. So it's been a great time for me, learning from you as well. I think I only have one message, and that would be never to forget about Myanmar in times where world politics is really going astray, and where any ideas of a kind of an international order is gone, basically, it seems. Myanmar is receiving less and less attention. So I hope that all of us, inside and outside the country, can do all we can to keep attention open and to kind of show the world that there is a kind of a heroic resistance going on against authoritarianism, and there is much to learn, I think, from the Burmese fight against dictatorship, and that people in the US or Russia or Turkey or Hungary or whatever other country that are facing similar struggles, that there are very, very impressive action taking place. And I think that the civil disobedience movements in Myanmar deserves much more attention that it has received so far. It received a lot of attention in the first year, and then as the violent conflict moved on, we all started talking about civil war and the different PDFs and the different battlefields, achievements or losses or whatever, and we kind of forgot that Myanmar managed to establish the world largest civil disobedience movements in the world ever. That is so impressive, and it should never be forgotten, and we should use every occasion to remember the great achievements. They actually delayed the functioning of the military state, and the fact that you had at some point more than 420,000 state employees that stopped working. It's so impressive, and I think that all Burmese should be very proud, regardless of what the future might bring. This is his achievement and something that the rest of us can learn from.
Many listeners know that in addition to offering these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about the current needs and proposals, we also have to handle emergency requests at times, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When these urgent requests come in, funds are often needed within just hours, so there's no time really to conduct targeted fundraisers. For these situations, we try and maintain an emergency fund. So please consider specifically helping us to maintain this emergency fund. we want to stress that a donation of literally any amount allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. Discover how to donate at betterburma.org/donation.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanang boda yaranang